Okay, welcome everyone. Feel free to follow along. If you have done this ahead of time, then that's not a problem, but I'm just going to give me a folder so that we can work in. So you should know the drill by now. Get a folder, get a file in there. And that's our JavaScript file. And if we want to test, then we can do one of those. One of those things. And then we have to turn it into a Node.js project. So right click on the folder, open a terminal, and in the terminal, we have to do npm init. And given that I've done the index.js file, I should be able to just use all of the defaults for that. Yes. And that gives me a package.json. If I'm going too quickly and you want to shortcut at any point, what you can also do is just copy the session3 folder or put an additional file in there. I'm just going to continue making a new one. So we'll say dev, and then the command, if you remember, was nodemon. And then nodemon takes the file that needs to be run. And that is like that. And if we save that, the only thing that we need to do is to also run this. So, well, not run, but we need to install. I'm too quick. So npm install nodemon as a developer tool. By the time we're at lesson 10, you'll be able to do this in your sleep. That's exactly why I'm doing it. So if you wonder why there is this save dev, there used to also be a command or an option called save that you had to use that is not really required anymore in npm. But the save dev still exists if you want to save something as a development tool rather than a production tool. So that's why we're doing that. And I have the impression that my internet is faster at home usually, so there we go. And this gives us nodemon. It gives us an additional script called dev. And now we can run this whole thing by saying npm run and the name of the script, which in our case is dev. Yeah, and don't confuse this dev with the save dev that we do for nodemon. It has nothing to do with it. If I would call my script work, then I could do the same thing here and just say run work. So you just have to make sure that the name that you have here after run is the same as the name of something you have in this scripts section. There we go. And that gives us the sentence that was written out by this console log command. So, good. I hope everyone was able to follow along with that. So we don't use the, or we don't need the package.json file for now. We're still going to continue to use our index.js file, and we're going to write stuff in there. And I'm not going to recap everything that we have seen last time, at least not in code, but just to give a little bit of framework again. So the first class we did initialization and tools. The second one we talked about variables, simple variables, numbers, strings, and booleans. And then last week we looked at more complex variables, which in JavaScript are arrays, so lists of things with a certain index. And remember that the index value then starts at 0 for arrays. And also we looked at the objects in JavaScript, where an object is something that has properties with a particular name, with a certain name. and the fact that we could combine all of those things together and so on. Now, what we have not done, or we have done it very few things with that, is we haven't actually used those variables very much. So we have to learn how we can do things with them. And in JavaScript, that means operators. That's what we're going to start with. What is an operator? Well, actually, you've already seen some operators. Let me give this example. You don't have to follow along yet if you don't want to. This is pi, and there is an operator in here. The operator is this equal sign, which is the assignment operator that says take the value that we have on the right-hand side and assign that to the variable, the constant variable in this case that we have on the left-hand side. So this equal sign is already an assignment operator. So that's one that we have already seen. We've seen more. I have at some point shown you that you can declare variables by using a comma. Technically, the comma is also an operator that separates different variables from each other, or different items in for parameters for a function, or different properties in a JavaScript object, or different items in an array, so for separating multiple things. And we've seen one more. I'm not sure whether we've seen it in the explanation of the homework or something like that, but when I type this, which writes out a number, of course, because we've defined pi as being a number. So if I say type of, then JavaScript gives me the type of the variable that I'm pointing to. And type of technically is also an operator that returns the type of the variable that we're dealing with. So those three we have already seen, but of course, the most interesting ones are still missing. And let's start with what you probably already know, and that is arithmetic. I think I got that. I didn't get that yet. Is that correct? See, arithmetic. Anyway, I'm obviously better at JavaScript than at typing English at the moment. So this should be relatively easy, yeah? So I can say things like result is 1 plus 2. The plus obviously is an operator, and it does exactly what you would expect in, well, in English, in math, if you want, and that is the addition of two items. And we're doing this with numbers. I'll come back to what else you can do with this, this plus, but this should be rather obvious. And when I do, when I write this out, my result value, it is now going to tell me the result is 3, which is what I would expect. So this is entirely logical. I can also do things like result is 5 minus 2, which if we can count should give us 3. So the minus is also an operator. And by the way, when I, 2 lessons ago, I think, when I told you that you can't define variables that have something like this in the name, the reason for that is that I could do this, yeah, but I can't do it with a hyphen. Why? Because the hyphen is reserved in JavaScript to be the subtraction operator, so you can't use it for other stuff. So this is entirely logical. There is also a division. If you remember math, that should give you 5. And the only one that maybe, well, there are 2 that are maybe a little bit more sketchy or difficult, and that is this one. Yeah, in many cases, when you do math, there would be either a dot there or an X. Those are 2 very common symbols for multiplication. That both would be difficult in JavaScript. If we would use an X, that would be the name of a variable, actually. If you would use a dot, we've seen last time that when you define an object, you can use the dot to access a property, or when you have an object, you can use the dot to access a method, a function for that object. So both the X and the dot are difficult. So in most programming languages, you end up with the asterisk to do multiplication. And then one last one here, which is also sometimes a little bit, where is it on my keyboard here? The result of this would be 4. That's the modulo operator. And what that says is when I divide 9 by 5, how much am I left with? What's the remainder of dividing 9 by 5? That's what that means. Yeah. So in this case, of course, I could do 9 divided by 5 with the division symbol, and that would be something else. But this explicitly says when you divide 9 by 5, how much have you left in that? So that's those are the only two that are perhaps a little bit, well, stranger than the other ones. But all of this is pretty straightforward, and that should not pose a lot of problems. Now, let's take this one step further and let me explain what developers have come up with to be more lazy. So why would you want to use operators? Well, something that you will very frequently do when you're writing software would be defining you have a variable and you want to add something to that variable. So I could write result equals, in other words, assign something to result. And what do I want to assign? Well, I want the value of result plus some other number. So I will say result plus 2. And let me be lazy and do copy paste. And when I run that, that's going to give me 6. Why? Well, the last thing we had here for result was 4. And actually, we can make our life a little bit easier by resetting it to something that we know here. So now it's 0. And then when I add 2, it is 2. So what is written out here is 2. So this is something that is very common. You take the value of result, you add 2 to that value, and then you put the result back, well, in result. It is so common that in JavaScript, you have some shortcuts for that. So I can say result, and then a combination of the addition and the assignment operator. And that actually works for all of the operators. All of them can be combined with an equal sign. Well, the ones that make sense here anyway. I don't think so for the remainder, but I'm actually not sure. Yeah, it should also work. So what this reads as is exactly the same as that. There is no difference as far as JavaScript is concerned. Yeah, you assign results to what it was plus 2, and here you do exactly the same. So when I write it out, you'll see that there is another 2 added to it. So we started by 0, then it went to 2, and then it went to 4. Like I said, you can do this for everything. So I can also say times 3, for example. Oops, 3. And when I write this out again, it should now be 12. So plus 2 times 3. So that is one shortcut. The other shortcut that you can take, and this shows how lazy developers are, is, well, something very, very common is that you just want to add 1. You have a loop and you want to increase the value somehow, and there is an even better shortcut for that. And that is this. And this looks completely strange because now I don't have an equal sign. I also don't have the number that I add, but what it does, as you can see here, is it adds 1 to whatever the variable is that we're using it on. And just the same, I could do this, and then it will subtract 1 from the variable that we have there. Again, this is mostly because this is so common while you're writing code, because code very often involves going over a collection of things, for example, and then adding one or subtracting one is something that happens quite a bit. And so you have shorthand operators to add arbitrary numbers or to multiply or subtract with arbitrary numbers, but you also have plus plus or minus minus that will help you to add or subtract one. And it's of course a very nice shorthand. Now, the confusing thing in JavaScript is that you can place that thing on both sides and it actually doesn't mean completely the same. I'm not telling you that you have to use this. I'm always very careful with this because usually I can't remember off the top of my head what the rules are, but there is a difference here. So when I run this, first of all, I now have 14. So here we were at 12 plus 1 plus 1. I'm at 14. So both of these statements add 1 to my result variable. If that's the case, then where is the difference? Well, let's do a little experiment. I'm going to, let's call this test 1. And then I'm going to say this is, and let us give result a value that we know. So we'll put that to 5. And then I'm going to do this. And we'll make a second test variable where I'm going to do that. And then log, and let's do this with a template string, test1 equals, and then remember what a template string is. It is something where you can use this dollar and then curly bracket notation, and test2 equals, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to have that in my template string. Test2 equals, and again, I will use the dollar curly brackets and then the name of the variable that I want. So the question is what this is going to give. I set result to be 5. I have this result, so we're pretty sure that result itself is going to end up as 7 because I've added to it twice. And each time I've used the shorthand, so I've added 1 each time. So result will be 7. We can include that in our tests if you want to make sure. But then the question is what test 1 and test 2 will be equal to. And if I just run that, you can see it here. Test 1 is 5, test 2 is 7 now. So our result is 7. There is no problem. That is entirely to be expected. I've added 1 2 times, 5 plus 2 is 7. The question is, why is test 1 equal to 5 and is test 2 equal to 7? And that has, of course, to do with the placement of this plus plus operator. When the pluses are at the end of the variable, the assignment is going to happen first, and then the addition happens, which means result is 5. That 5 is added to, or is put into the variable test1, and then result is increased. And when the pluses are in front of the result variable, then the addition happens first, and then it is assigned to test2. So both of them, when you put them on a separate line, both of them will increase by 1, but make no mistake, they do something different when you start using them in expressions. Now, you can do 2 things. You can remember what the difference is and then use this type of construction, or you could make it easy for yourself and not do this, and then you won't have a problem. So as long as you do this on separate lines, you'll never have a problem. It will be a little bit longer if you write it like like this, result, for example, and then you do the addition on a separate line, then there is no confusion. As long as you use this plus plus operator with something on in a single statement, you know what it's going to do, and it doesn't matter whether the pluses are in the front, at the front or at the end of the variable. Unless you feel very confident and you want to afterwards have to examine your code in great detail to see what happens in almost all cases, I think I would prefer not to do combinations like this, because you have to really understand what happens also 6 months afterwards. But know that both of the operators exist and that there is a difference, and in some cases you can take advantage of that. Okay, so there is one operator that I didn't explain, and the reason is that it was introduced. Well, there are multiple operators, but for mathematics, there is one that was added in a later version of JavaScript, in ES6, if I'm not mistaken. And so you could use it in Node.js. You can't use it in traditional switch scripting. And that is the power of operator. What is power of? Well, it would be something result is 5 to the power 3. What is 5 to the power 3? Everyone who can calculate quickly, I'm going to guess it's 125. We'll see whether I'm still awake. There we go. So 5 times 5 times 5. And what you normally would write in mathematical notation, you would write 5 and then you have an exponent above the, to the right and above of the number. That is this double asterisk operator. The only thing that you need to be aware of or need to be a little bit careful of maybe is that where you have plus plus and minus minus, which are shorthands for shorthand for add one or subtract one, the double asterisk is actually something else and is a separate operator. So power of 5 to the power of 3 in this particular example.
Can I interrupt a bit?
Yes, yes, of course.
I just made an experiment myself. If you go back to the test 1 and test 2 and do the opposite way, so the first one has the plus plus result and the second one result plus plus.
Yes. So like this, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. And?
Yeah, you get a totally different thing. Well,
Yes,
it works as it should, but I mean, it shows how
yes,
different those two are.
So it's still logical. Result is 5.
Yeah.
Here you do the addition first, so you get 6, and then you assign it to test 1. So that's why test 1 is 6. And then here you do the addition afterwards. So test 2 also ends up at 6. That's exactly what I meant, Jan. It's a nice way of showing it. It's exactly what I meant. I think these things are dangerous.
Yeah.
And I usually prefer to stay away from them. Writing code that doesn't have problems is hard enough already. Yeah, you can do this, but I would not advise you to do it.
Well, as you say, in 6 months ahead, you will be really confused when you start to look at it.
That's the thing. And so when you do this, you would almost be forced to also write a comment above it to explain what it does. And then what's the point? I mean, at that point, you can just as well split it up into 2 statements. It will be entirely clear what happens. And you'll have less comments to write. So
yeah,
this is a point that is because we're doing all of these very short things, it's a point that is very difficult to get across. But if you look at 2 pieces of JavaScript, and that's also why I said I had comments on the homework that you did, when you look at different pieces of JavaScript, they very well could all do the same thing, but I still probably would have a preference for one over the other because of how easy it is to understand or how maintainable it is in the future. And so there are quite a few things that you can do in JavaScript that I would never do because I forget the rules, and I don't want to have to go look it up every time I look at this bit of code again.
Yeah.
So because this is mathematics, let me do this. I had some example here. That's why I'm looking away. So what's result now? Well, JavaScript is going to behave exactly the same as you should in mathematical calculations. That means that there are not just operators, there are higher order operators or higher priority operators than others, just as you have in mathematics. In mathematics, what they teach you is that you have to evaluate something from, I think, right to left, if I remember correctly. But they also teach you that some operators, like the multiplication, has a higher priority than an addition. So in this kind of statement, what you have to do is 2 times 2, and then 3 times 3, and then you have to do the addition. So that should be 4 and 9, which should give us 13. Yes, you can make your life easier because just as in mathematics, you can work with brackets. Yeah, so I can put, or parentheses, I can put stuff in between parentheses. And that is much easier to read in a way. Normally, I would also write it this way, but I think if I, so notice that I have these parentheses there. If I now do save, they disappear. Why? Because my Prettier plugin knows the mathematical rules as well. This thing is amazingly complex, actually. So it knows that it has, JavaScript has these rules, and so it knows that the parentheses I put in are non-intentional. They don't differ. They don't make any difference to the calculation. And so my Prettier plugin here decides that it's going to remove them because that's going to be easier to read. You can differ of opinion about that if you want, and modify how Prettier works. But notice that when I do this, well, first of all, my result that I have here is different because now I'm doing things in a different order. But now the parentheses do serve a purpose. And so Prettier, in this case, has not removed them. It leaves them in place. So it's a pretty smart thing. You might not see that if you haven't installed this Prettier plugin. So if it doesn't work on your end and the parentheses stay wherever you put them, then it's simply because you haven't enabled that. That is not bad. And like I said, normally I would put them there and keep them there because, again, it is easier to read. And I don't want to have to think afterwards what it is that I wanted to do because probably I will get confused otherwise. Okay, so when I explained the plus operator, I said we're dealing with numbers. We've already seen another way. So I can say my favorite animal is a penguin. What we've already seen is that I can do things like plus and then add something to that. So in this case, I am not adding 2 numbers together, but I'm using the same operator to add 2 strings together. Now, this is, of course, not applicable to all of the operators. In other words, I can't use my favorite minus, for example. Theoretically, JavaScript could have defined a use for that, but it hasn't. It is so for the plus. And what I can also do is I could say, instead of doing this, I could say something like my favorites. And then I'm going to use this contraction of plus and equal. And it does exactly the same as it would do for numbers. So the meaning here, the way you should read this is take the value of my favorite, add the other string I have there, and then put it back into my favorite. And when I write out, I will be very lazy and do copy paste. When I write out my favorite now, it has simply added that point to the end of the string. What we've also seen already is that we can use the plus in this way in all kinds of mixed environments as well. So I could do something like, I'm actually not sure what's going to happen now. Yeah, it's exactly what I thought. So now I have a string, and then it has converted the number into a string and then added that in there. We've already seen that when we were talking about the simple variables, that you can do these kinds of implicit conversions from one type to another, here from a number to a string. And that also works with either the plus for strings or with the plus equal as a contraction. Okay. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. I have the chat window open here, so you can ask questions in, I think we established in at least 4 languages. And if you use simple Spanish, I might get what you're saying as well. But you can also unmute yourself and speak up if that is easier. So those are a few of the simple mathematical operators, and then some of those that you can use for strings as well. The next bit that we could think of is equality. And this is a very important concept when we have time, and I think we will have for once. I'll also show a little bit of what you can do with that and look at if-then statements, and then it becomes a little bit more fun because we can actually do something with these variables for a change. But equality is a very important concept. And so let me create 2 variables. Okay. So what I could ask myself is, are these 2 things equal to each other? And how can we test that? Well, remember that JavaScript has a Boolean type, and the Boolean type can be either true or false. That was true or false. And we can use the comparison operators, and they will tell us either true or false, depending on whether it is the same or not. So if I say number equals 13, what is the answer going to be? Well, the answer is going to be false, because obviously these 2 things are not the same. Be very careful here if you don't have a lot of development experience. Look at this one here. This is 1 equal sign. That is the assignment operator. Look at this one here. This is 2 equal signs, and that is a comparison operator. A frequent mistake would be to do something like this. And this is a completely different result. Actually, what I'm saying now is I'm assigning 13 to the variable number, and then the result of that is 13, because number is now 13, yeah? Which is completely different than doing a comparison between these 2 things, where the answer is going to be false. And it's difficult when you're just getting started with scripting or development, because, well, we don't know this concept in English. In English, we're used to this equal sign, and the equal sign is, well, a comparison, if you want. Is this the same as something else? So you have to take care that when you're doing a comparison, or you want to do a comparison, that you're using a double equality sign. You also have the opposite. So I can use this for testing as well. And then the answer is true. Why? Well, this operator asks the question, are these 2 things different? And the answer is yes. Number is 42, and I'm comparing it to 13. So the answer is going to be true. These 2 things are different. Be careful with getting that Boolean logic in your head. Yeah? It can be a little bit freaky to use this unequal, because it is, I don't know, for some reason our brain has an easier time dealing with equality than with inequality. So sometimes it's worthwhile rephrasing the question so that you can use an equal operator rather than an unequal operator if you have the choice. And I'll say that again when we talk about if then else and you do comparisons there, but it's already the same here. Yeah, so equality and inequality.
David, what about 3 equal signs? Is that a strictly way?
Yes, yes, very good question. So let me take one step before we go there, and then it will become absolutely clear. Because JavaScript is really annoying with this. It has something else as well. So I'm going to do this. Number equals my string. Number, which actually is not a very great name for a JavaScript variable because there is a function called number, but with a capital in it. So I should be ashamed of myself of using that, but I'll do it anyway, it's clear. So number is 42, and my string here is 42, but as a string. So what is this? Well, JavaScript is really, really simple. You're asking it to compare a number and a string. So what it is going to do is it is going to convert one into the other, normally the number into the string, and then it's going to compare the two and it sees that they're the same. So it tells you true, these two things are equal. Now that poses a bit of a problem, of course, and the fact that JavaScript is so relaxed about types causes a bit of a problem, because what if I want to know, well, what if I want to make sure that both are numbers? And if one is a number and one is a string, I don't want the answer that they are the same. I want to know about that. And that is where what Jan asked, the triple equality. And don't worry, we're going to stop at 3. There is nothing with 4 equality signs. But that's where the triple equality comes into. If I run that, it tells me false. Why is that? Well, because the normal equality, how do I do that? Compares only values. Yeah? And the triple equality, that should be that. Oh, come on. Compares values and types. So in order for the normal equality, the comparison to give me a true, the value on each side has to be identical. If I have a triple equality sign, then the value needs to be the same and the type has to be the same. So if I would convert this into a string, it is going to tell me true. But as soon as it is a different type, it gives me a false. That also means, and it is something that very few people do in JavaScript, and I don't always do it, but it also means that when you want to do comparisons and when you do if then else, you'll do the same kind of comparison to see whether something is true or not. When you want to do comparisons, it can often be safer in a way to use a triple equality sign, because then you are sure that if you're expecting a string and you test for equality for a certain value, with the triple equality that you have here, it is going to compare both the value and the fact that you have a string on either side. And that can sometimes, well, save you from unforeseen problems in there.
I've seen in PDF Toolbox now that they encourage triple equal signs. When you do Java, you get a warning if you just use two instead.
That is because, and here you probably won't get one because Prettier can't know what you're intending, or maybe I've switched it off, but I'm pretty sure if I would do an if statement and I would do it, I would get the same warning here. So PDF Toolbox in the latest versions, when you write scripts, it included from 11 point something, I think, it included a somewhat better JavaScript editor that does syntax coloring and some other stuff. And it implements something like ESLint or Prettier in there, and that gives you the warning. It is only a warning, yeah? So you can perfectly well ignore that if you feel brave. It is only a warning, but usually when you have a choice, it is safer to do this.
And so you can also use the strict inequality then. You can have the exclamation point and
Yes.
to...
And it looks completely stupid, so that would look like that. It's not 3 exclamation points, but it's an exclamation point and then 2 equality signs. And that has exactly the same meaning. What is this doing? It's the same thing. It will say false if the values are different. Yeah, that is logical. And the one we have now here says false if values or the types are different.
Yeah, it's strange.
Yeah. It is a little bit strange. Actually, it is because JavaScript kind of shot itself in the foot by being very relaxed to begin with, and then having to come up with something like this to do that. A language like Swift, for example, you don't have that much need for that because everything is type checked, and so you would know much earlier than you're doing something that is not allowed. But in JavaScript, yeah, you have both concepts, and like I said, feel free to use what you feel most comfortable with, but the most correct in most cases is the triple equality or the triple inequality.
Yeah, and especially PDF Toolbox where input could be both,
Yeah.
I mean, numbers could be strings. And then you have add a number type in your script in PDF Toolbox, and then you can.
Then again, and I feel obliged to give this warning. Then again, there are instances where someone will use a normal equality or inequality for a good reason. Yeah, I mean, if you know that you're going to do something and the result might either be 0 as a number or 0 as something in a string, then, and both are okay, then the normal equality is actually perfectly fine. So if you look at JavaScript code that someone else has written, don't go through the code just simply changing all the double equality signs by triple ones because you think, oh, that was such a stupid developer, I'm going to fix this quickly. Because it might be that at some point there is actually a reason for it. Now, if there is no comment about that, then it's a bad developer, but that doesn't help you if you break the code meanwhile. So be a little bit careful about that. Now that we're in this logic of comparison and Booleans and so on, something that I probably don't really have to show, but I will anyway. So what I can also do is something like 2 is smaller than 5. The answer to that would be true, obviously. Yeah, so you not only can test for equality, you can also test for smaller than or equal, or bigger than or equal. So all of those work as you would expect them to work in regular mathematics and regular logic. What you could wonder is, actually, it's a very long time since I've tried something like that. But you could wonder whether this is also going to work for strings, and the answer is yes, it's going to work for strings, and you're going to be doing a simple alphabetical comparison. Be very careful about that. I don't know whether this would already cause it. No. So there is usually somewhere where you can make it fail by using a small or a capital instead. So you have to be a bit careful because this is an alphabetical comparison, and you might again get some results that you're not expecting. So equalities, and then also smaller than, greater than, and so on. It's all not that difficult. So let's add some else with it. We've seen some stuff with numbers. We've seen some stuff with strings. There are some additional operators for Booleans. So I can define a variable that is false and another one that is true. We've seen what that is.
Sorry, David, just a question going back to the comparison with the letters.
Mm-hmm.
This has to do with the ASCII code as well or something like that, because I just tried using the accent and having, you know, the E, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and I got true or false depending on which one I'm putting in, you know.
Yeah, so it's a comparison that is based on, it's an alphabetical comparison, what I said, that is not strictly true, but it's also because the concept of alphabetical comparison is a bit too broad. What I said the second lesson, I think, is that JavaScript strings use UTF-8, so Unicode strings.
Mm-hmm.
And it will use those codes to do the comparison, which is strictly speaking the only thing it can do. Of course, when you have strange languages like French with accents, you could get strange results.
Yeah, and the thing that is strange to me, it's a mix of these things, because like when you use a capital A, it was comparing actually, let's say, the two lower cases between A and B. But if you use an accented glyph, then it uses the Unicode code.
Normally,
That's
if you look up the Unicode values of the characters that you have in the string, you should be able to see how it works and that one comes in front of the other. What that normally means is that you have to be very careful in doing stuff like this. I know that when you use Node.js, for example, there are modules that you can use, Node.js modules, that do string comparison in a better way. And sometimes you need that. And let's say that you want to put stuff in a dictionary and you want to do it in some kind of logical, alphabetical order, then you need to take into account the different scripts and so on. And there are modules that specialize in offering services like that. So if you ever have to do something like that, that goes further than a simple lowercase a to b or something like that, just remember, don't try to do it yourself. You're going to fail, I guarantee you. Anything with Unicode is insanely difficult if you try to do it correctly, but there are Node.js modules. Look at one of those and implement that. It's going to be a lot better and a lot safer than trying to come up with a solution yourself.
Okay.
That's always my answer, by the way. There is always a module that does it better than what you could do. And that seems a trivial remark, but trust me, it is not once you start writing code.
Sometimes it's called David.
Well, that's also a possibility. I might charge you in chocolate or something like that. We can come up with something. So let's look at these here. And I want to give you 3 additional operators that have to do with Booleans. So when I write out my false, what I'm going to get is obviously just false. Let me do something here and no, David, like that. So I'm going to comment out all of this other stuff. And now when we run it, we only get what we are interested in here. So when I write out this variable, the value is false, and that is what we get here. There are 3 Boolean operators, and the first one is this one here. And that one is a negation. So when I do this, it is true. So if my original value is false, and I negate it using this exclamation mark, then I get true. If the original value is true, lo and behold, we get false. So not too difficult. It will reverse anything to the opposite Boolean value. Then what you can also do is you can, and this is a very frequent thing, of course, if you want to start doing if then else, very often it's not just one thing you want to check, but it's a combination of multiple things. So what happens when I do my false or David's, my true, then I get true. This one is false, this one is true. Boolean logic says if you use or, and that is this double pipe symbol. If you don't know how to type that on your keyboard, I want to tell you, but I have to type it in order to, yeah, there. It is Shift, Option, and then L that does that. If it's not on your keyboard, so Shift, Option, or Alt, and then the letter L, and that will give you a, at least on my keyboard, it's a little bit keyboard dependent. It will give you a pipe symbol, that's what this is called, and a double pipe symbol in JavaScript is used as an OR. So the rules for OR, for Boolean logic, you can look that up online, but basically false and false is false, false and true is true, true and false is true, and true is true. Now, I'm pretty sure none of that registered, but if you hesitate, just look up the rules for Boolean logic and remember that this is an OR. Yeah, so this double thing here is an OR. Now I can do the same thing, but then for and remember the rules for and, something is true only if both of the other conditions are true. So the and is a double ampersand. And that's going to write out false, of course, because this is false and this is true. They are not both true, so the result of this is false in the end. And of course, I can combine these as well. So I can have as many of them as I want. I can use parentheses in there to have priority and stuff like that. You can start making all kinds of combinations. It is always the same. Keep it as simple as possible. Okay. So we have the or and the and what I meanwhile removed was the not. That's the short name for it. So not. That does a reversal of a Boolean value. The only thing you have to be really careful about, but again, this goes back to the rules on Boolean logic, is when you start combining these things. Yeah, because if you say not this or not that, that becomes a little bit tricky. So if you start thinking about things like that, it would be, I don't have the time to explain it here. I will be more than happy to devote some time at some other point to that. But you have to know that the not operator in combination with or and, for me, it sometimes behaves counterintuitive. So be very careful when you combine these things. Okay, so I want to stop there for operators. I just want to introduce if then else. That will make for more interesting homework the next time, I'm sure. I want to introduce that. I will introduce another operator at the end of the lesson. Before we do that, there are some things that I skipped, and I skipped them on purpose because they aren't used very often. Yeah, so if you look up operators, some of the operators are more advanced. They use ES6 specific syntax. We will come back to that later if we talk about all kinds of modern ES6 stuff. That is quite nice. Some of the other operators are, I've just skipped them because I'm not sure you're ever going to come in contact with them. For example, there are operators to work with bits, bit masks and stuff like that. That is something that you might need at some point, but the chance is that you won't need it. So I'm also going to skip that here. Okay, so Operators. Let's talk about how we use those, and it is good that we just saw this Boolean stuff, because that's what we're going to do next. So what I can do here is that I can say, let's introduce or start to introduce some control logic, and I will use a variable with that as well. So we're going to define today's temperature. It's pretty warm in Ghent. And what I can say is temperature larger than 20. I will explain in a second what I'm doing. Yeah, and now it says it's warm. If I change my temperature to 8 and I do the same thing, it doesn't say anything. Yeah. And that, of course, is the essence of an if statement. An if statement in JavaScript and in just about any programming language is used to conditionally execute statements. And the form I've used here is one that I don't like. And I tell you, I'll tell you exactly in a second what I like better, but it is a valid way of writing it. So what I'm writing is if. That is a keyword. That's why it's colored differently. And that means that JavaScript now knows that we're starting an if statement. The if has to be followed by the condition that you want to test. You can see it's in between parentheses, and then there is a condition. This is one of the Boolean things, the comparison things that we've seen before. Temperature larger than 20. Temperature is 25, so this will be true, temperature larger than 20. And if this condition is true, then the statement that follows is going to be executed. Okay. Now, let me tell you why I don't like this. Okay. When I do this, it says it's warm, very warm, and now we're going to make it cold. And it still writes it's very warm. Why? An if statement like this, the only statement that is controlled, that is conditional, is the one following the if. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the same line, so I could do something like this, but you can see that Prettier doesn't like that. But the only statement that is conditional is the one that is following. So if you only have one statement, then there is no problem. But in general, I find it bad form because to me, it is more difficult to read. That's a matter of taste. So the better way of doing this is using parentheses and curly braces in this case. Yeah. So if, and then the condition that we are wanting to test, and then you have these curly braces, and those statements in between those are now conditional. And when I run it now, you can see that both of the statements are now skipped. So in general, this is the format that I prefer. Even if there is only one statement, I will always write it like this. Why? First of all, this puts a little bit more structure in your code, which again makes it easier to read and to understand 6 months from now. I know I keep saying this over and over, but it's because it's important. But also because if I now later want to add additional conditional statements here, I want to add additional stuff, I don't have a risk. I can just do it inside of these curly braces and we're fine. If I don't use these, then I have to introduce them when I want to split this up into multiple statements. And so there is a higher risk in that case. Now, if I can do an if, you can imagine that maybe I also want to do something if the temperature, if this condition here is not true. So this line is only executed when my condition is true. What if I want to run something if the condition is not true? Well, it's almost English. I can say if and then else, and I'll give you immediately the form I like the best, which again is with these curly brackets there, and I can put something there as well. And now I'll say it's cold. Right now it writes out it's cold. Why? Temperature was set to 8. If the temperature is higher than 20, then we say it's warm. If the temperature is lower than 20, we say it's cold. Now, this is a dangerous way of saying it, because when I say it like that, it sounds like nothing is going to happen when the temperature is equal to 20. But in fact, what we're doing here is a comparison greater than. So if the temperature is exactly 20, you should be able to guess that it's going to write out it's cold. Why? 20 is not strictly greater than 20, it is equal. Yeah, so it writes out it's cold. If I modify my statement, it's going to write out that it's warm, because now I say greater than or equal to 20, and that is the case. 20 is equal to 20, so then it does this part. And now it goes back to cold. So while I can, of course, create much more complex things with this conditional statement, what you're looking at here is the essence of conditional statements in JavaScript. I have a keyword if, I have the condition that I want to test for. If that condition tests as true, then the first part after the if is executed. If I have an else, then the second part is executed if the condition is not true. The else is optional, so I could do it like this, and that's not a problem. Or you can have both. And like I said, you can lose some of the structure, and as long as it's only one statement that is conditional, but I would really, really advise you not to, and always use that same format. Now, two more things. So we're going to keep more or less to the...
I will have to say something about that. You can do it in a bit different way. You can put the console log it's cold before the if statement and skip the else.
Yes.
Then it will always be cold except when it's warm.
You could, yes. Although here it's difficult, because then it's going to write out it's cold, and then it's going to write out it's warm as well if it's warm. Yeah. Yeah. But with assignments, you're absolutely correct. So that is something that yeah, that I use a lot as well. Maybe I will put an example of that in the homework. So let me show you one of the quirks of JavaScript again. Yeah, this is a bit strange. I have a variable that is called temperature, and it is, well, you should know what it is. I haven't put a value in it, so the value is undefined. Yeah, and we can see that. I write out what I have in there, it is undefined. I haven't put a value in it, so it is undefined. And then I say, is that bigger than 20? And it's going to tell me it's cold, and that's because you're using this undefined value. All the conversions that you have, all the implicit type conversions that you have are going to play here as well. So if I just do this, just a variable by itself, it's going to tell me it's cold. Why? Well, this is undefined. If undefined, when it converts to a Boolean, gives you a false. The same actually with null. Null is not true. It is false. The same with the value 0. 0 will be converted into false, so it's still cold. What with that? Now it's warm. Why? This is a string. This string is not null or 0 or something that resembles 0 for JavaScript. So it says, okay, in that case, it's true. And so it writes out it's warm. What if it's an empty string? Well, an empty string is something that resembles nothing, so it's false. So because it's false, we write out it's cold. So you have to be really careful about this. JavaScript assumes that there is a condition here, and as soon as, or no, let me put it the other way, unless you have something here in this condition that is not resembling nothing or false, JavaScript is automatically going to write it out as, or it's going to consider it as a true. Yeah? So everything that converts to null, undefined, 0, empty string, all of those things are converted to false. Everything else is converted to true. This can be really useful, but it can also be dangerous again. Yeah? And so just realize that that happens. Why can it be useful? Well, for temperature, it's perhaps a little bit strange, but let's say that, again, I have used this, I have used some code to ask the user what their favorite animal is. Well, if the user hasn't answered yet, and this is undefined, then I'm going to end up here. If the user has, if I've asked him, but he said nothing, then I'm going to end up here with an empty string perhaps. And that is also still going to end up in the it's cold clause. If I'm explicitly setting this to null because I don't know yet, then it's also going to test and end up in here. So very often you can use this feature as some kind of an error checking if you want. Yeah, I want to do something if I have a favorite animal, and when I write something like this, I know that this code that now says it's warm is going to be used when there is a favorite animal. So I could say, I'm making a mess here. Favorite animal is, and we'll use what we just learned there. And in the other case, no favorite animal. And when I run this, it says no favorite animal because I haven't put anything in there. When it's an empty string, it says no favorite animal. When I put something in there, now it will say my favorite animal is a penguin. Yeah. So you can often use this as a way of handling multiple values for a variable, such as undefined, null, an empty string, and so on. All of those are going to convert to false. If you want to know whether something will convert to false or not, I could do something like Boolean value of something. There is a, just as we used number before, you can also do this. And now Boolean value will be either true or false, depending on whether this thing evaluates as true or false. And that allows you to see what happens when you do a conversion of null or a conversion of undefined or any of these special cases that we've seen, or an empty string and anything like that. Yeah, this if then, of course, we're going to see more structure in JavaScript in the next lesson when we will look at functions and loops and so on. But this if else is a very, very, very common feature. And conditional programming, the ability to, depending on a comparison or some kind of conditional statement, more broadly put, the ability of, depending on that, doing one part of the code or another part of the code is a very important part of development. So this is something that you're going to see over and over again. And of course, you can combine these things. I haven't said that yet, but you could very well imagine that I could have another if-then inside of my else, for example, and there are some more advanced things that you can do with this as well. Have a look online, perhaps, but I can, for example, do this. What am I doing wrong? I should use this instead. Yeah. So I could do something like, if animal is ostrich, do one thing. If the animal is penguin, do something else. And now I can add another else and do something yet different if it's not an ostrich or not a penguin. So this if else can be combined in a number of interesting ways to make more elaborate statements. I do this kind of as an afterthought, this else if, because in most situations you can come up with a better way of implementing this, and we'll see that next time normally as well. So this does not really have my preference. There are cases where it's useful, but it's not the most legible construct again. Yeah. So yes, you can use this. Do you have to use it? That is perhaps something different.
Question though, David.
Yes.
You often see that you write if animal not equal to empty string.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, is that any different than just writing out the animal?
Yeah, what is different is that you make it explicit. So what you're saying is if animal is not equal to this, that's what you mean. So let's remove all the rest of this stuff here. So does this make sense or not? Well, not really.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not really necessary. Actually, you could do this as well. It gets worse. What I told you is that it's better to do this.
Yeah.
Yes. In this case, it's not, because if animal is undefined, this is going to be false. You probably want it to be true, but if animal is undefined is not equal to an empty string, because an empty string is a string. That's the type. Undefined has type undefined. So this is going to return false, which is the opposite of what you want. So in most cases, if you want to do something when you have a reasonable value for animal, it is better to write it like this, and it will automatically handle the case where animal is an empty string, where animal is undefined, where animal is null. All of those cases will be handled automatically now. And I will only get here when I have something, an actual value in animal. Watch out, of course, it's not because you have something in animal that it's guaranteed to be a string. I could just as well have a number in there, and it's also going to do whatever is here, because 42 is something.
Yeah.
So you still have to be careful, but the comparison to, and I make this mistake as well. So I'm the first one to admit that I'm not always doing this properly, but doing this is often, well, as dangerous as well, it's often dangerous and it's not good. This is much better. It's shorter. It is better in terms of how JavaScript is going to handle things. So in general, just do this.
Okay.
Any other questions? Now would be a really good time because I'm done. Doesn't look like it's good. So you can easily find the you can easily find the definition of all the operators, for example, when you Google for JavaScript and an operator, and then you'll get a much longer list of the variables we've seen here. So not all variables, as I said, are in this class. I think the most common ones are here. Yeah. The other thing, if you're interested, that you could Google is, and where was that piece here, is operator precedence, I think is what it is called. And then you'll get a list of all JavaScript variables, all JavaScript operators, and their importance, their priority in there. And that will tell you that the multiplication, for example, has a higher priority than the addition. And actually, I will answer to the extension question in a second, but I just realized that I promised you to show one more operator. That one is a strange one. So we had what we wanted to do here was say if animal, then well, let's create another variable. So if animal, selected animal is true, and otherwise no true. Yes, thank you. And otherwise, and now what Jan just said would make sense, but I will make it explicit for a moment. Yeah, so I could write something like this. So I have a variable that is undefined here, and I say, look at what the client has given me. If there is an animal, then selected animal is true, otherwise selected animal is false. So I want to make a Boolean that remembers whether a favorite animal has been selected or not. Yeah. What Jan said is, but you can save a little typing, and I agree. So you can specify one case. Yeah, so instead of leaving this variable undefined, I can by default assign false to it. And then I say, well, I only need this part now, because if there is an animal selected, then I'm going to set it to true. If this is not executed, it's already false, so I can get away with this. So this is a shorter way of doing that. There is an even shorter way, and whether you want to use it or not is totally up to you, because it's a little bit of a strange thing at first, but you can also do something like this: selected animal equals animal, and prettier is probably going to remove the brackets for me. Yeah, it is. Also, it's not happy with me, which would be because we've already defined that. So now that shouldn't be a problem. There. So this is kind of strange. These two things together are an operator. It's called a ternary operator because there are three operands involved. And what it does is it's a shorthand for the if-else statement. So the way you should read this is, I'm going to give selected animal to a value. What is the value? Well, if this condition is true, it is going to give that as the value. If this condition is not true, it's going to give that as a value. Yeah. Why would you use this? Well, if you have short statements, then this can be in a way more legible than the if-else construct, which would give you 5 lines of code at least, or 6 lines of code if we count this one as well. Yeah, while this is 1 line of code, and especially for short stuff, it can be much easier to deal with. It is also sometimes a little bit more difficult because it's a very terse notation, a very, very condensed notation. So whether you want to use this operator or not is is completely up to you. But it does exist, and it works exactly the same as an if then else, with the condition at the front. And if you have a complex condition, then you will have to put parentheses around it, but in this case it's not necessary, and that's why Prettier removes it when I save. And then the value when true is the second part, and the value when not true is the third part. And of course, that doesn't have to be this simple. I could say something like, let me try something else. Favorite animal, and then if user equals David, it will be penguin. And in another case, it probably is not a penguin. That works just as well. So same principle. This is the comparison statement. User equals David. I'm probably going to get an error on this because user is not defined as a variable. Yeah, but user equals David, and I should, if I'm good, use a triple here. If that is true, then the favorite animal variable will be a penguin. If it's not true, then it will be the second part. So that is just as good as doing that with an if-else statement. Answer to the question, what is this extension? I think I showed that in the first lesson, I think. Let me see if I can find it again. It is the one that does most of the work, I think, because I have two installed, and sometimes it's difficult to know which one does what. But there is one called ESLint as an extension for Visual Studio Code, and the other one is called Prettier. And you can find that on the Visual Studio Code module website. Just download it and activate it, and it comes with a settings that you can customize to say exactly what you want. For example, whether you want, we talked about this, whether you want double or single quotes, for example, that is part of the settings. Okay. If there are any other questions, now would be a good time. If not, then that is it for today. If you still, because no one, I think, dared to do it, but if you still want to look at the homework for lesson 3, that is on the Facebook group. If you don't find it, send me a message and I will point you to it. Just send it to me afterwards and I will be happy to give feedback. I will record, I don't know when yet, but I will record a 5-minute video to show how I would solve it, and then discuss some reasons why I would do it that way, because I had some discussions with other people as well, like Christian, to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches, and I think it's useful to share that as well. But that will be a short video, maybe this weekend, and then I will undoubtedly try to come up with some homework for this time. Now that we've seen if then else statements and stuff like that, the whole thing becomes a little bit more fun because we can start doing things now. Okay, thank you very much. If you have questions afterwards when you try stuff, don't hesitate. Just send me a short email or post your question on the 4-piece cafe group. There are plenty of people who can help you with that on that group. So just post it there or send me a message. I don't want you to get stuck. So rather than feeling that you don't understand what's happening, just ask. There is no shame in that. And if you try something and it doesn't work, you can also, you can always ask as well, and then we'll try to figure out together why it doesn't work, which is not always so trivial, but it's usually fun to figure it out. So thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully I will see all of you next week. So Thursday again at 4 p.m. CET, that is Belgian time. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.